Hi everyone, Chris here from Tennant Painting Studio, and today I'm going to be talking about the hidden costs behind starting airbrushing. If you're considering buying an airbrush, today I'd like to share with you a few tips and tricks that I've had along the way which will actually hopefully make your life a little bit easier when starting out. Now, I first started airbrushing about 6 months ago. I had no idea where I was going to begin, so today, like I said, I'm going to talk to you about a few of the bits and pieces which I haven't necessarily seen in other videos. Basically, I want to make a video which I wish I had seen at the time. So the first thing you're going to need to consider is what airbrush you're going to buy. So before you can do that, you need to look at what is the purpose your airbrush is going to have. Are you looking to do fine detail with your airbrush? Are you looking to do just general base coats, or a little bit of in between? Once you've worked that out, what you need to do then is go online and do your research. I would always recommend trying to find a reputable brand like Badger or Evolution or Iwata. These are fantastic, very well established brands. They've got great customer support and it's very easy to get replacement parts from. So how much does an airbrush cost? Well, I actually picked up mine. I got a Badger Patriot 105. It cost me around about £120, and that's a good solid airbrush. I've had absolutely no problems with it. It comes apart very easily. It goes back together again really easily. It's very quick to assemble, and also any part that gets broken I can replace simply. It fits my needs nicely. Now, there are two different types of airbrushes. Of course, you've got the gravity and siphon feed. Depending on what you use will also affect the price. Now, for those of you who don't know, a siphon feed airbrush is basically an airbrush where the paint is stored in a little bottle underneath the airbrush and then it's siphoned up into the airflow. And the gravity feed is the complete opposite. It's kept in the top cap and it pours down into the airflow using, well, gravity. Depending on what your actual needs are, I personally recommend the gravity feed as you get a little bit more control over what colours you're mixing. The siphon feed is great if you're just going to base coat models, or if you're doing larger sprayed areas such as for base coating or for RC cars or something like that. Take your time to find the airbrush that you think is going to help you the best with what you want to do. Bear in mind that you want to start a reasonably priced one. I would say at least £100 upwards, as in this sort of price range you're kind of sticking to a reasonable budget, but at the same time you're not going super cheap at this as well, so you've got a good chance to grow your collection if you want to and really learn the basics, which is exactly what I've been doing. Your next item you're going to need for any airbrush is going to be the air supply. Now, there are kind of two options to this. You can either buy the tins of compressed air, or you can do what I would really recommend, and that is get a compressor. A compressor is literally a small little machine which creates air and pushes it through a hose into the airbrush itself. A good compressor, you should be able to control the PSI, and you should be able to have a moisture trap in there, and other features such as auto shut-offs are very useful as well. A good compressor will run you at least around about £80, if not more. If size is not really an issue for you, if you're just doing small scale projects, then you do not need to consider something like a reserve air tank. I don't use one and mine runs fine. It just means a little bit noisier. I do recommend as well purchasing a moisture trap. These can vary in price depending on the model of your airbrush compressor. Certain compressors can only use certain moisture trap components depending on the brand. But do double check that, and it is worth picking one up, because if moisture gets into the airflow, it can affect your paint consistency, and you don't want that to happen on your miniatures. A quick aside with your airbrush as well, something else you need to consider buying is the hose. Now, most airbrush compressors and airbrushes might come with a hose. I would strongly recommend getting a carbon fibre hose. I've got this one just here. Again, this thing came from Amazon. I also needed to order some new replacement ends to it. Now the advantage to these ends is that I've now got a whole pack of them, so if I change the airbrush, I've got lots of different fixtures and fittings depending on if I need to. It's really worth picking up. They're not tremendously expensive, and also get a slightly longer hose than what you think you're going to need. This is a 4-meter cabling. I've never needed to use all 4 meters, but it also means that it's never going to get pulled tight when I'm actually working. There's always a nice bit of slack, gives me a lot more flexibility. I really recommend picking up a decent hose for your airbrush. So once you've got the airbrush, the next thing to consider now is how are you going to clean it after you've used it, because paint sticks. So you are going to need a few different cleaning products. Now the first thing you're always going to need is Airbrush Cleaner. The brand I recommend is Vallejo. It's a great airbrush cleaner. It's not the cheapest stuff, but you do dilute it down. What I recommend is getting a little plastic pot, put some airbrush cleaner in there, put some water in there, and then once you're done with a project, just make sure that you take the airbrush apart, put it in there, give it a shake up, leave it for a little while. You can leave it for an hour if you want, and then clean out with some paper towel and dry it off. Now, another thing to bear in mind, that you are going to need a few extra tools. I would highly recommend getting a tube pipe cleaner, which so once the airbrush is taken apart, you can really clean out in between the grooves. You also want to get, it's basically, I don't know what name of it is, but it's a little sharp tool. It looks a little bit like a small ice pick, and that's for getting into the nozzle and cleaning out any dried paint in there, which is going to block up your airbrush and stop it from producing the results that you want. You'll find this will happen if you start, either paint isn't coming out or it's requiring additional PSI to do so. So make sure you get a little tool there. It is such a useful thing to have. Another thing to bear in mind with your airbrush is when you're going to clean it, is you should also be cleaning it fairly regularly whilst you're actually using it. Now, I would always recommend doing a quick clean down each time you change paint colour. The way I do this is I literally bought a cheap plastic container, a tub around about that sort of size, about 30-40 centimeters by 25, something like that, with a lid. I just fill it up with plain water, and what I do is after I finish each paint I want to change over, tip out the remaining paint in there, dip it in, push the air through. If you put your finger on the end of the airbrush and pull back, if you've got a dual action one, which is another airbrush tip I would recommend, is a dual action is much better. Slightly harder learning curve, but much better results in the long run. So, sorry I forgot to mention that earlier. So, if you put your finger on the end and push down so the airflow comes through and then pull back, it will cause the paint or any liquid in there to back up and start pushing back up again. This is a really good way to clear that extra paint out, tip it out, rinse it out again in the water, get some tissue paper or kitchen paper and just wipe it around so it's nice and clear. So when you squirt water through, it's going to come through crystal clear and you're ready to go. Always make sure that you squirt that through to make sure there's no paint comes through. Squirt on a piece of paper or something to make sure that you're clean and it's not going to taint your next paint. Next thing I'd recommend is getting one of these. This is a little airbrush cleaner pot. It's got a small filter on the top there. You can see this has got a little bit of liquid in there already. All you have to do with this is sit your airbrush on there and then just squeeze it in. You can use this to get rid of any excess paint you've got left in there if you don't want to tip it out into the water. You can use it to, I use this a lot for resting the airbrush when I'm not using it as well. It's got this really useful thing. It's nice, get a nice sturdy one that's preferably glass or really something that's heavy, because what you don't want to do is it tipping over while you're actually painting. These aren't expensive. These will run about £5 to £10, but again, a really useful addition. Finally, to recommend cleaning your airbrush, I would recommend getting an ultrasonic cleaner. Now, an ultrasonic cleaner, for those who don't know, is basically what jewelers use to clean jewellery, watches, anything like that. It uses sound along with water in order to vibrate at a very high frequency, or ultrasonic frequency, which causes any sort of dirt to sort of shake off the actual product, whatever's inside. It will come with a small little basket. You just put your airbrush in there, you strip it down, so a little bit of water, a little tiny splash of airbrush cleaner just to give it that extra cleaning solution, stick it on for a few rotations, a few minutes, 5-10 minutes at most, and it's a really good way to clean out the inside of that brush. Take it out, rinse it under the cold tap, dry it off, and you're done. Now, these things will run you anywhere between £25 to £100 depending on what the size you want. If you're just using it to clean your airbrush, probably just need a 25, 30 pound model. You don't need to be all singing or dancing, you don't need heat control. A standard ultrasonic cleaner, again from Amazon or eBay, will do you just nicely. Now when it comes to actually spraying with your airbrush, there are a couple of things to bear in mind. If you're just going to spray in a room, you're going to need to make sure that you have some sort of ventilation. Always spray with the window open if you're inside, I would recommend that. And also I would recommend looking into getting an extractor booth. Now, in the case I am now, I actually have an awful lot of ventilation above where I spray, so that's not an issue for me. But you do want to bear in mind that you are spraying very fine paint particles. It's very easy to breathe those in. So really do look at getting some sort of mask. The mask I use is literally one of those little ones that just goes across your face there. It's got filters on it, just to really make sure that you're not breathing in those harmful paints. Most of the paints from Vallejo and Games Workshop etc. are non-toxic, but still, breathing that in is not going to be good for your lungs long term, so I do recommend getting one. They can range anywhere between a few pounds all the way up to 50, 60 pounds upwards, depending on the complexity and amount of spraying you're doing. But they are literally going to save your life in the long run, so really do invest in one of those. Use ventilation. On this point, I would also recommend looking into getting a spray booth. Now a spray booth is literally just a little booth to spray your models in so the paint doesn't go everywhere. Normally these will have some sort of extractor fan as well. What I normally do is, because I've got a lot of ventilation here and I've got the mask, that's not a big problem for me. I just have a great big piece of cardboard which I use at the back to make sure I don't hit the wall behind me. Also, you don't need to buy one. You can actually make one. There are lots of guides online. If you type in how to make your own spray booth depending on the size you want. I believe Black Magic Craft put out a great video on how he made a very large one for his studio. I highly recommend checking that out. I'll put a link in the description of that video. If you start to notice a strong smell when you're spraying, stop. Make sure you've got that ventilation. It's really important. It's your health after all. You don't want to risk it. So now you've got your airbrush, you've got your compressor, you've got your cleaning supplies, you've got your extraction, you've got your mask. What other things are you going to need? So one of the big things I highly recommend everyone get is some gloves, some latex gloves. These are going to save you from getting so much paint in your hands. They're really inexpensive. You can get them from biodegradable materials now, which is something else I would recommend just because it's good for the environment. Save those turtles. They are really useful. They stop paint getting on your hands when you're handing the miniature and turning it around, things like that. You will notice sometimes they will start to get a bit sticky and they might start to go a little bit more solid because the paint will dry on them. That's absolutely fine. It's much better that happens if you wear jewellery like a wedding ring or something. Your wife or husband is not going to be too pleased if you've got a lot of paint or primer on your ring. So just by having, you can't just put it in your ultrasonic to clean it off, they will know. So just put a glove on your hand while you're spraying. It's also really useful if you're doing aerosol spraying as well. We've all been there, we've caught our fingers black when we've been spraying our models. So just get one of those gloves. They're not expensive. Next thing I'm going to talk to you now is about airbrushing itself, the actual paints you're going to use. Now, first of all, you can use almost any paints you want, acrylic based paints. I haven't experimented with enamels, I haven't experimented with oil based paints, mostly because some of those paints can actually break down the components inside the airbrush, so always do a little bit of extra research before you spray any of those. If you're using acrylic based paints such as Vallejo, Citadel, Army Painter, Green Stuff World, any of those sorts of paints, you're going to be absolutely fine. Now, I would recommend looking into their airbrush range. Now, Vallejo Air are obviously the largest ones of those. They come in little dropper bottles, just like this. This is the blue one that we use in our upcoming Chappy Towel video, which will be out next week. These are designed to go straight into the airbrush without having to do any watering down on them. I'll come to that in a moment. Now, Citadel have recently launched their Citadel Air range. I'll be completely honest, I haven't actually tried those out yet. I've heard from a couple of people that work really, really well. The only downside to me is the fact that they don't come in a dropper bottle style. However, I would recommend transferring, and this is going to be something I'll be doing later on in the year, is transferring all the Citadel paints over to dropper bottles. We'll do a video on that later in the year because I'm planning on turning all 100 plus paints I've got into those dropper bottles. Now, the other thing to bear in mind with the paint is that even though some of the air paints say they can go into an airbrush and be sprayed out straight away, or the primers or whatever, don't take their word for it. What I would recommend first of all is when you pour the paint into the cup, and again I'm assuming you're using a gravity feed here, have a look and check how thick the paint is. It should have the consistency of about milk, so maybe slightly thicker depending what you're doing, slightly thinner. Bear in mind, the thicker the paint is, the higher the PSI is going to be, and the more likely it is it's going to block up your airbrush. So go on the side of caution. You can always add a little bit more paint to it. You can always adjust the consistency to match what you need. I like to airbrush on a very low PSI for a little bit more control, so therefore your paint should be watered down just a little bit more. Time, patience and practice are certainly going to tell you exactly what you need to do. So how do you water down or dilute your paints? Well, you can use water. If you're going to use water, I would recommend using distilled water. It was a tip that was given to me a long time ago. The reason for it, and I don't think it realistically will affect me where I am with my water supply, but if you're someone that's got a lot of heavy metals in your water, got very heavy water, sorry, not heavy metals, sorry. If you've got heavy water, the mineral content in that water can sometimes affect the paint a little bit. The other option that I would recommend, which is probably going to be a little bit easier and certainly more accessible, and I use this a lot more, is to get some flow improver. Now, the flow improver I've actually got is a Winsor & Newton. I have a bottle, there it is. Now this actually came, this is a Vallejo bottle, little dropper bottle, because I originally bought some of the Vallejo flow improver, and then I got some Winsor & Newton and I just decanted it into that bottle there, as it was just easier for me to use. I haven't noticed any difference between the two. Some people prefer to use airbrush medium, some people prefer flow improver. It's entirely up to you, experiment, see what you like, but I would recommend before you can't just pour in, especially things like the Citadel base or layer paints, you can't just pour them in and spray away. You will clog up your airbrush, and you have to stop, strip it down, clean it all down. I've had to do this before myself, so please learn from my mistakes and don't do that. Some flow improver, the Winsor & Newton one cost about £4 or £5. It was not expensive. It will last a very long time because you're only using a couple of drops. Plus, flow improver is so useful to have. I find it much better than water for diluting your paints. I use a wet palette for my normal paints, but you can use flow improver metallics and it makes them so much easier to use. So I highly recommend that for the sake of a few pounds. Really recommended. Okay, and the last thing I recommend is getting some corks. Now, the reason for this is when you're painting your models, having something to hold on to while you're spraying is going to be really important. So what I'd recommend you do is get some corks. So as you can see on this one here, I've just got this very large, this is a 50mm cork bung I picked up online on eBay. Picked up a pack of 10 of these for around about £6-7 delivered, and all I do then is I just attach the piece onto there using a paper clip, super glue it in, just push that down there. Some of these corks will be quite dense, so what you can do is get a pair of pliers to push the actual pin down into it. So it stays in there, it gives you a good rotation to spray from, you get all the angles in. If you're doing zenithal sprays, you can really control the angle. Bear in mind, if I was spraying well like that, I'm going to be spraying down onto my hand. So remember, those gloves are going to protect your hand from that paint. That's going to be really, really useful for you. These corks are not expensive. The other cork I get is this. Now this is technically a yoga block. It's a very dense piece of cork. Now I recommend using something like this as opposed to a piece of polystyrene or a piece of, well, wood's not going to work, is because this is quite heavy. So when you're spraying, not only can I hold this easily and turn it around in my hand, etc, etc, this is not hard to do, and you can get all the way around using your airbrush, but also if you put it down, it's not going to tip over. You can have lots of components on here, spray them all up at the same time, great for undercoating. Just make sure that you can turn it. If you super glued and push them in properly, you can turn them upside down. They're not going to fall out of this. The weight of it means that you're not going to knock it over. It's not going to tip anywhere. It's a good solid foundation. If you want to as well, I haven't got one of these yet for myself, but I will be picking one of these up in the next couple of weeks. You can get a Lazy Susan. If you don't know what it is, a Lazy Susan is basically a small little turnstile. So you can just put the cork block on there with all the things pinned in there, and then you can just slowly spin it around by yourself. But bear in mind, like I said, it is more dense than normal cork, which does mean that pushing in the paper clips is going to be slightly more difficult. But if you use a pair of pliers, it's going to be really easy. So those are my hidden costs and little tips when it comes out to starting out airbrushing. Now, this video was meant to be a little bit of a guide as to the sort of things you might want to look at buying. I will put a list in the description below of all the different items. Most of them came off Amazon. I'll also put a link to Blackmagic Craft's extractor fan booth. You can check that out because it's a really great video, and his terrain stuff is fantastic. I'd highly recommend checking that out. If you want to see more sort of tips on airbrushing or any advice or anything like that, or any questions at all, please just put a comment down below. I'll make sure I read every single one of them. If you've got a suggestion for a video, then like I say, put a comment down, send us a message any way you like. We are on Facebook, we are on Instagram, so make sure to check us out on there. We are still very new to the whole YouTube game. We're still learning. Hopefully you're enjoying these sort of videos. They're a lot of fun to make. So thank you very much for watching, and we'll see you in the next video. Just a reminder, if you enjoy this kind of content, then subscribe to the channel for more. You can also consider supporting us on Patreon. Just $2 a month goes a very long way to keeping the channel going and providing new content every single week. Make sure to follow us on social media. We'll see you in the next video.